First Comics had some very good titles. In fact, Howard Chaykin's American Flag and Grimjack by John Ostrander and Timothy Truman were two of the most highly regarded comic series of the 80s. They also had Dreadstar by Jim Starlin. Now, this was a science fiction storyline that Starlin had actually begun in the pages of Epic Illustrated, Marvel's kind of version of Heavy Metal, which was creator owned. So that meant that he could have stuff published in there and still have it published elsewhere. He also wound up having it published in one of Marvel's other imprints. Then you've got Mirage Licensing, who struck gold in 1984 with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And then a couple of years later, in 1986, with Usagi Yojimbo by Stan Sakai. Now, we've talked about the Ninja Turtles and the sort of the inspiration for them. It was, a statement, a satiric statement about all the popular tropes in comics at that time by Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, who invested their tax return to print a sample first issue, which then got picked up by Mirage. Now, Usagi Yojimbo, like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, has got, it looks like it would be a funny animal book because the characters are animals and they're very cartoony, even more so than the Ninja Turtles. However, it is a very serious book. It is about a Ronin, a masterless samurai in the early modern Japan period in the 16th and 17th century. Very much a samurai story. Stan Sakai, who was born in Japan, after he moved to the U.S., his first comics job was as letterer for Gru the Wanderer. Then within a couple of years, he was doing this very, very long-running title, and since then he has won 6 Eisner Awards, 4 of them for his lettering. Dave Sim created Cerebus the Aardvark in 1977 from Aardvark Vanaheim Productions, which essentially is Dave Sim. So this one is also very long-running. It lasted more than a quarter of a century. It ended on the 300th issue, and like Gru the Wanderer, it was a takeoff on Conan the Barbarian, except the dangerous mercenary swordsman was an aardvark. Then in the late 70s, you've got a couple of series, both of which we've mentioned before, that were truly independent, in that they weren't really even attached initially to a major publisher, much like Cerebus the Aardvark. You had American Splendor, which was produced by Harvey Pekar, eventually got picked up by other publishers. And you had Wendy and Richard Piney's Elf Quest from Warp Graphics, which essentially was Wendy and Richard Piney. Also, starting in 1980, another one we've talked about already, Raw, which was an anthology comic that featured all kinds of significant things, not the least of which certainly was the serialization of what would become Mouse. Kind of similar to Kitchen Sink Press, you had Last Gasp Productions. That's one of the underground comics publishing companies that we talked about when we were discussing the beginning of the underground movement. And like Kitchen Sink, they endured. Essentially Last Gasp Productions is Robert Crumb and Alan Kaminsky, now Alan Kaminsky Crumb, their stuff, and occasionally other people's stuff. There was a series called Weirdo that ran for 13 years starting in 1981 from them. 1983, from Comico, you had Grendel by Matt Wagner, which was the story of an assassin that ran until 1997 when Comico when they went out of business, and then Dark Horse picked it up after that. You also have from New England Comics, The Tick by Ben Edlund, which is also, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a satire, a parody of superhero comics, except this is much more of a parody. It's not like it's not being ironic. It's very, very humorous. The Tick is this sort of stereotype of a standard superhero with a square jaw, and it's just it was hilarious. It was later made into an animated series in the 1990s and 2 different live-action series, all of which are also hilarious. Not so hilarious, The Crow. Very, very serious right there, but that is something that made it almost immediately to the movies. It was first released in 1989 by Caliber Comics. Later on, it was carried by Image and I think maybe IDW or Dark Horse. Anyhow, very, very long-running character that, like I said, made it to the big screen relatively quickly. Cartoon books, CB, is basically Jeff Smith, who had a long-running book called Bone. Now, this looks like a funny animal, cartoony kind of book, and it actually is. It's about these 3 cousins, the Bone cousins, who get lost in a desert and then wind up in this magical valley. And then the series is about how they wind up going on many different quests to help the inhabitants of this valley in which they're trapped. Strangers in Paradise from Terry Moore, Abstract Studio, which basically is Terry Moore, was kind of a slice of life comic that initially was about a romantic triangle between 2 women and 1 man who were friends, and it was just sort of following their lives. Now, I mentioned this when I talked about romance comics and how they just died by the late 70s. Some people have referred to this as a romance comic, but it's not really. It's more, like I said, it's just about life. When Dark Horse Comics debuted in 1986, probably no one would have ventured to guess that within 20 years they would be one of the major players in comic books. They got off to a small and slow start, which I guess actually does make them a dark horse, right? A dark horse is someone who wins a race they weren't expected to do well in. Anyway, 1986, they debuted with titles like Boris the Bear and Dark Horse Presents, in the first issue of which we were introduced to a character called Black Cross, and shortly afterward to a character that became fairly popular, Concrete. However, issue 10 of Dark Horse Presents in 1987 is what really is going to eventually get them a lot of attention. A character called The Mask, which of course would later become a movie with Jim Carrey. And then a few years later, they were the home publisher of Mike Mignola's Hellboy. So The Mask and Hellboy became pop culture touchstones, major films, as big and as successful as anything that Marvel or DC were putting out in the 1990s by that point. Now, they also were the publisher for a couple of different critically acclaimed series by Frank Miller. Starting with Sin City in 1991, there were several different series of Sin City, and then in 1998, 300. And again, both of those were made into major films. In the 2000s, they got the reprint rights and the licensing rights to a couple of interesting things. Warren Magazine's Creepy and Eerie, those horror magazines that had come out back in the 1960s and lasted until the early 80s when the company went bankrupt. Well, Dark Horse started reprinting all of those, and they did in fact reprint the entire run of both magazines, and then introduced a new creepy magazine with all new stories. They did something similar with Conan, which had its license lapse, which had been licensed for like 30 years by Marvel Comics. So Dark Horse was able to get the rights to reprint the entire run of Savage Sword of Conan, which was the Marvel black and white magazine that ran from the 70s to the 90s, and many new Conan stories in, one series called Conan, and then there were several miniseries as well. So that really put them as clearly someone who is in the top brackets, but they got there. They got there earlier. They got there about 5 years after they were established in 1991. This is what really made the difference for Dark Horse. Marvel had the license for Star Wars. They'd gotten that in 1977. Roy Thomas had pushed hard for it because he thought it was promising. The movie hadn't come out. No one had any idea what this was going to be or how big it was going to be. But Marvel, they had a Star Wars series that lasted for about 10 years, but then was canceled. A little bit of the interest waned after the third movie in the original trilogy had come out. And so Marvel lost the license and Dark Horse got it. And they started with an adaptation of a popular novel, a Star Wars novel called Dark Empire. And from there, they expanded, and they did several different Star Wars series in the 90s and 2000s, including Knights of the Old Republic. So that got their foot in the door in a big way, got them a lot of sales, right? Because, Star Wars. And, the more people were buying Star Wars comics from Dark Horse, the more ads they were seeing for the other cool stuff that Dark Horse had. And that was just the beginning in the 90s. Dark Horse wound up kind of in a way almost replacing Dell Comics as the kings of the licenses. They were doing comic book versions of all kinds of different TV shows and movie series, including Aliens and RoboCop and Army of Darkness. They had a James Bond series. They had a long-running Buffy the Vampire series. Now, eventually, they were kind of superseded in that category in the late 2000s by Dynamite Comics. But for a while there, just about anything that was based on a movie or a TV show was probably showing up at Dark Horse. X-Files, that was another one. All right, Malibu Comics debuted in 1986, and they also got kind of a slow start. By 1993, some of their superhero comics that they had introduced, they decided to sort of interconnect into a universe, which they called the Ultraverse. Now, this was at a time, 1993, that sort of the peak of interest in comic books was happening. It was a bubble, in fact, and you know what happens to bubbles and that happened the very next year in 1994. But anyway, for a brief while here, they had all these interconnected superhero titles, and even before those, in 1990, they had a quirky little title called The Men in Black that several years later would also make it to the big screen. Well, I kind of hinted around 1994 was going to be a bad year for Malibu. 1994 was a bad year for everybody in the comics business. But Malibu was, they were just kind of getting started, and they had just started growing, and it was more than they could handle, this sudden downturn in the industry. So, almost like, I don't know, like vultures circling in the sky, DC Comics showed up ready to buy up their characters because, hey, for 50 years at that point, that's what Marvel had been doing. Marvel was where comic book publishers went after they died, right? But Marvel, I mean DC was where comic book publishers went after they died. But Marvel stepped in. They stepped in because they didn't want DC to get these characters. They didn't want DC to get any kind of potential advantage. So they negotiated with the owners, and they sort of swept in and scooped up Malibu, and they got the sale. They got the company, they got the characters, and then they rebooted the whole thing, the whole Ultra Force universe, crossing it over with Marvel characters. So here you've got Marvel's The Black Knight, now a member of Ultra Force. Within a year, all of those former Malibu titles that Marvel's doing, all of them were canceled. Partly because it was 1994-95 and a lot of stuff was getting canceled, but partly because Marvel wasn't putting a lot of effort into holding on to these things. They didn't get these characters because they wanted to use them. They got these characters because they didn't want DC to use them. By the way, this basically what amounted to wholesale slaughter of the Ultraverse and of Malibu by Marvel came to be known as Black September. All right, well, there are several important companies that we haven't focused on yet, like Wildstorm and Image in the early 90s, IDW, which debuted in 1999, and Dynamite Comics that we've mentioned several times that debuted in 2005. But we haven't talked about them yet because we haven't got there, right? We've just been talking about the companies that were established in the 1980s during what was really a renaissance of independent comics companies. So now we're going to step back from that. We're going to step back to the world of the big two in the 80s, and we're going to see how the Bronze Age ended and what it led into. Well, first we're going to look at some common themes that showed up in the Bronze Age in the 1970s and the first half of the 1980s. First of all, post-apocalyptic themes. There were a lot of those, a whole lot, in both Marvel and DC. And in fact, there were post-apocalyptic themes in a lot of movies at that time, like Damnation Alley, I remember in particular. So you've got Deathlock from Marvel appearing in Astonishing Tales, Deathlock the Demolisher, alias Luther Manning, who is a former soldier whose dead body is hooked up to cybernetic parts, making him a cyborg, and so that's why he looks kind of funny, because he's literally decomposing. And Killraven in Amazing Adventures. This is another one by Don McGregor. Killraven is the guy on the lower right. It looks like he's being stomped on there. This this storyline imagined what it would be like in an alternate reality if Martians had conquered the Earth, and so there's a human rebellion against them. So you've got that over at DC. We talked about these earlier. You've got Commandy, the last boy on Earth, and also Hercules, that is basically set in the same timeline, the same alternate parallel Earth. Also, OMAC was. You've got Hercules in the future, not in the past. By the way, DC had its version of Hercules, and Marvel has its version of Hercules. The Marvel version also, from time to time, has been known to be an adventure set far in the future with a science fiction bent, which is kind of weird. But there you have it. All right, another thing that was common in the Bronze Age was team-up books. These were really big in the 1970s and the first part of the 1980s. So you had books like over at Marvel Team Up, which when it first started in the early 70s, the first few issues, just kind of paired random people together. But pretty quickly, they settled on Spider-Man as the star of the show. So for the majority of the, I think, 150 issue run of this book, it was another Spider-Man title in which each issue Spider-Man teamed up with a different superhero. Some of them kind of strange. He teamed up with Howard the Duck once, and once he teamed up with the cast of Saturday Night Live. Marvel 2-in-1 was the same kind of thing, except it was the Thing meeting somebody new each time. As you can see, Captain America apparently doesn't get a day off, and neither does Green Arrow over here in DC. So the Brave and the Bold, which had originally been kind of a tryout, kind of showcase title, by 1970 had become the Batman team up, and it was joined a little later by DC Comics Presents, in which Superman meets someone different every time. Batman and Superman didn't meet each other in these very often because they already were teaming up every month in World's Finest. And actually, Marvel and DC both even had their own supervillain team up. So you've got the Secret Society of Supervillains at DC and supervillain team up over at Marvel. Another thing that was fairly common in Marvel and DC in the 70s, especially into the early 80s, was the super bromance. Now, Dr. Doom and the Red Skull, that's not one of these super bromances. Although actually the Red Skull, former Nazi that he was, did get along better with Dr. Doom than he did with Holocaust survivor Magneto. But anyway, so I mentioned World's Finest and Superman. They had been teaming up regularly since the early 1940s in that title. And the way the characters were presented in the 70s, they were the best of friends. They knew each other's secret identity. They liked to hang out together. They were just pals. And in the late 80s, when things were kind of retconned and reimagined, as we shall see, that was changed. And from the late 80s on, it seemed as though Batman and Superman just couldn't stand each other. You also had, of course, Green Lantern and Green Arrow in the 70s. We've talked about their big multi-issue, multi-year road trip. And over at Marvel, you had Iron Man and Captain America kind of in the same position as Superman and Batman at DC, which is to say they were presented as the best of pals. They were best friends. That also, mid to late 80s, got changed at Marvel, and all of a sudden, Iron Man and Captain America are always in conflict. Now, if your familiarity with these characters comes mostly from the movies rather than from the actual comic books, you'll still recognize what I'm saying. When I say that in the late 80s there was a turn where things got really dark, and these two duos of heroes who had always been presented as best friends are now kind of reluctant allies and sometimes have outright enmity for one another, and that's how it's been presented in the more recent movies. All right, other sort of buddy movie type comic book heroes. You had Spider-Man and Daredevil, who crossed over from one book to the other quite frequently in the 1970s, and by the 1980s, knew one another's secret identities even. Daredevil has that super hearing, and he can identify someone by the sound of their heartbeat. So really, all he had to do was meet Peter Parker one time. Also, you've got Luke Cage and Iron Fist. We've talked about them. We haven't talked about Wonder Man and the Beast in the pages of the Avengers, especially as drawn by George Perez in the late 70s and early 80s. The Beast, of course, formerly one of the X-Men, and later, again, one of the X-Men, but for the 70s in the Avengers, he and his pal Wonder Man frequently went on drinking binges and went to concerts together, and it was really fun. It was just really a fun thing to see. Also very fun in DC in the 80s, Booster Gold and Blue Beetle. They were in the Justice League, and in some ways they were almost like the comedy relief. They had that snappy banter that was very entertaining, which made it kind of a bummer in, I think, 2005 when DC just brutally killed off that version of the Blue Beetle. Spoiler alert. And also Spider-Man and the Human Torch, which we've kind of alluded to before, right? They're both roughly around the same age. And here's one of my favorite scenes from 1980s comics when Spider-Man, I think this was when the alien black costume that became Venom was removed. Anyway, he's there at the Fantastic Four headquarters without a costume. So the Human Torch comes up with something for him, and it's this shoeless old Fantastic Four outfit with a paper bag for a mask, and on his back a "Kick Me" sign. Fun stuff.